In the year of 1820, there were roughly 123,000 people living throughout New York City. At the time, the population group of New York was composed of mostly native-born Americans, who mostly identified as Protestant Christians. The once major ethnic division between citizens of both the English and Dutch ancestry had subsided by this point in history. Also at the time, New York was a peaceful city that lacked any major crime, even so much so that New York didn't even have their own official police forces, mostly operated under local neighborhood watches. However, this time period of a peaceful New York would forever change in 1825 with the opening of the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal is a massive waterway that connects all the way through New York, and through the opening of the Erie Canal, New York became a central hub for the transportation of goods. Cheap labor was used to help build the Erie Canal, with many labor jobs being filled by the multitude of immigrants entering the United States through New York. The city grew extremely fast, with the city lacking proper planning to accommodate this massive influx of population. Apartment tracts sprung up on the streets, lacking both sewers and safe drinking water. With not enough physical capacity, there were also drastic overcrowded living conditions, which helped spread both medical and criminal outbreaks. Within the 1820s, the biggest group of immigrants to arrive in New York were the Irish. The Irish immigrants, who were mostly poor and Catholic Christian, were America's first urban ethnic group. In an effort to maintain their ethnic background, the Irish opened their own stores, known as green grocery speakeasies, which they formed in their own ghetto neighborhood, known as the 5 Points. It would be in this neighborhood that the first official gangs of the United States would be formed. This neighborhood was an area located in the Paradise Square district, where 5 streets once intersected. Much of the previously mentioned deteriorating conditions of New York was especially prevalent in the 5 Points, as it was seen as one of New York's worst slums. Apart from just preserving their ethnic backgrounds, the Irish also opened their green grocery speakeasies as alternatives for traditional shopping markets that were often too expensive for Irish men and women. Unfortunately, however, the cheaper option also reflected in its quality, with many of the meats and fruits sold either being partially or fully rotten. These green grocery speakeasies, however, also provided a disguise for a building to house illegal activities in their back rooms, with the first of these speakeasies being created by a woman named Rosanna Piers. Rosanna would draw out customers into her back room by offering cheap homemade liquor. Not too long into her store's creation, a variety of different criminals would begin to occupy her store. Among these criminals were the members of New York's first official street gang of America, which were known as the 40 Thieves. With the gang's creation came Rosanna Piers, creating the back room of her store into the headquarters of the 40 Thieves, being led by a man named Edward Coleman. The 40 Thieves would dominate the 5 Points district for over a decade, until 1856, when Coleman had been arrested for murdering his wife. This first official gang of the United States being formed and how they were formed gave birth to rivaling gangs being created in other back rooms of other green grocery stores. Many of the fellow first official gangs of America and New York would be the Chichesters, the Roach Guards, the Plug Uglies, the Shirt Tails, and the Dead Rabbits. Let's take, for example, the Roach Guards and the Dead Rabbits. The Roach Guards were formed as a protective gang meant to protect the liquor sellers of the 5 Points. One evening during a meeting of the Roach Guards, a member of a dissident faction from within the gang threw a dead rabbit into the crowd. Why this was significant is because within Irish culture, a dead rabbit is a sign to be fearful of a man. This dissident faction would leave the Roach Guards and form their own gang called the Dead Rabbits, making both of these gangs sworn rivals. Let's talk about an area north of the 5 Points, known as the Bowery. Here in the Bowery, many young men would work as butchers, which also presented an area where many of these young men would also fall into the gang world. One of the most prominent gangs within the Bowery were the Bowery Boys, who would often battle against the Dead Rabbits. Battles between the Bowery Boys and the Dead Rabbits were intense, lasting days on end and using physical objects such as bricks, knives, and bats. Women that were supporting both gangs assisted by standing by to tend to their injuries, supplying weapons, or sometimes even joining in on the fight themselves. One of the most famous Irish women gangsters who fought alongside the Dead Rabbits was Hellcat Maggie. Maggie would hone her teeth razor sharp, using it as a weapon to fiercely bite her opponents, as well as wearing artificial fingernails made of brass to inflict deep scratching pain. These battles between early street gangs in the Bowery were extremely intense, so intensive that the little law enforcement presence New York had was not enough. Not only was this not enough, but even the National Guard themselves being sent in was still not enough, demanding that the regular army themselves had to be sent in to stop the violence. With New York now losing its sense of a peace haven, this would gradually take the attention of residents who lived there, with newspapers now beginning to change their focus on reporting crime and the rise of street gangs. By 1840, the population of New York had risen to 300,000 people. By this point, New York had now gone through an immense social change with crime taking over, in large part due to the gangs that had established themselves throughout the area starting in the 1820s. It was also during this time that the social phenomenon of street gangs had begun to expand outside of New York and into other major United States cities and states. Take, for example, the city of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, which had an approximated number of 100 street gangs between the 1840s and 1870s. With such a growing presence of gangs, as well as civil disobedience riots, citizens demanded a more effective system of law and order that went beyond their current system at the time, which mostly composed of day and night watch systems. These day and night watch systems were deemed ineffective to combat the growing presence of crime, with criticisms ranging. Such criticisms included the fact that most of the watchmen were only ordinary citizens that would demonstrate very erratic and inefficient behavior. With industrialization, modernity, a longer lifespan, and democratic societies, came the idea that citizens should have certain basic rights. One of these important rights included granting citizens certain protections under governmental supervision, such as the right to own property, free from the threat that others may take or destroy it. Professional governmental law enforcement stepped to serve this function. This function was served, with New Yorkers looking to London and their police system as the solution. The first professional police force was London's Metropolitan Police Force, created in 1829 by Sir Robert Peel. 16 years later, New York would follow suit, creating America's very first police force in 1845. Other American cities would follow New York's direction and establish their own police forces, with official establishments being in every major American city by the mid-1860s, and even some smaller American cities having their own police forces. The gangs were not intimidated by the early New York police forces, attacking them with fierce intensity. For Irish gangs, much of their attacks toward the police was motivated on a personal level, reflecting much of the cultural baggage from their struggles in Ireland and England. This was especially true due to the uniforms of the early New York police force, which attempted to look like the uniforms of London's Metropolitan Police Force. The English and the Irish historically have had a lot of negative history with one another, particularly due to the Great Irish Potato Famine, which was amplified in a great deal due to the English. In 1850, the population of New York City had exceeded over 500,000 people, with an estimated 30,000 of this population belonging to gang members. During the mid to late 1800s, street gangs directly influenced the result of New York's political elections. Political institutions such as Tammany Hall used gangs to influence elections. These gangs would influence political elections by scaring away citizens from voting polls in return for favors by these politicians. These favors would range, but mostly consisted of providing these gangs with safe meet-out locations, allowing the gangs to gather in locations bought and owned by the politicians, as well as catering to the gangs with vices, such as providing them with alcohol, gambling, and prostitution. In turn, the politician had bought themselves muscle power as they sought re-elections. A good example of one of these corrupt politicians was Fernando Wood. Born in 1812, Fernando Wood came to New York from Philadelphia with his family, where he went into the liquor and cigar business as a young man. Fernando was elected to Congress in 1840, majorly through the support of Tammany Hall. After attempting to run for New York mayor in 1850 and losing, Fernando chose to utilize corruption to win his next election. Using corruption of gangs and even the police in the 1852 primary, gangs had taken ballot boxes and not allowed entrance to the polls, while the police stood by and did nothing. Control of the police was estimated to be worth as many as 10,000 votes in a mayoral election at a time when fewer than 100,000 votes were cast. While earlier mayors had attempted to preserve a degree of legitimacy in their use of political power, Fernando Wood made little effort to conceal his willingness to run city government for his own benefit and that of his Tammany Hall allies. The corruption and politicization of Wood's administration directly contributed to the creation of rival police forces and prompted intervention by the New York state government. Amid this breakdown of authority, local street gangs thrived, capitalizing on the chaos and the growing influence they held within the city's political and social landscape. Focusing off New York City, let's see what was going on during this time period regarding gang activity in other major United States cities as well, such as New Orleans, Baltimore, and Richmond. Within Baltimore, massive migration came to the city, with most of this mass migration coming from the Irish, similarly to New York, as well as German immigrants as well. Between the years of 1830 to 1860, their numbers pushed Baltimore's population from 80,000 to roughly 212,000. Many of these Baltimore gangs included gangs such as the Rip Raps, the American Rattlers, and the Blood Tubs. Like the immigrants from the Northeast, many of these immigrants were poor and Catholic. Just as similarly to the New York gangs, Baltimore gangs also used their force to influence local elections, such as many of them actually traveling to Philadelphia in the mid-1850s to disrupt their local elections. As this was occurring, native-born Baltimore gangs, as well as native-born New Orleans gangs, fought against immigrant Irish and German gangs, as well as the newly formed police force of these cities. Beyond just expanding their attempts to influence Philadelphia's local elections, naturally Baltimore gangs used their influence to affect their own local elections as well. It's been described that these gangs were being used to maintain hegemony in voting patterns, and that a pattern of quid pro quo was formed between gangs and politicians. Such efforts to maintain hegemony from those native-born Baltimore gangs included many different intimidation acts. An example of such intimidation acts included immigrants being kidnapped by native gangs and being kept in sheds, where they would often be held, and often made to drink large amounts of alcohol, and then beaten and robbed. They would then be transported on Election Day, where these immigrants would cast votes in favor of who these native gangs had told them to support. Let's touch very briefly about the gang activity in Richmond, Virginia. There were over 30 documented gangs in Richmond during the mid-1800s, which consisted of mostly white upper-middle-class boys who had plenty of free time to do so. As immigrants began to settle in Richmond, their youth would form gangs, which in turn caused the native gangs of Richmond to fight against those new immigrant gangs. Let's begin to move toward the late 1800s. Beginning from the earlier 1800s, the Irish had been the prominent group to dominate the American gang world. But by the late 1800s, their status as new immigrants had mostly subsided, with many of them now being integrated and assimilated into American culture. This status had begun to change for various reasons. For one, the Irish, as decades went on, slowly began to change their economic status in America, with many of them by the late 1800s dominating the police force, having gained much more political power through institutions such as the previously mentioned Tammany Hall in New York, as well as building a much stronger kinship with native-born Americans as they fought alongside them in the Civil War. With the Irish having now been seen as assimilated into America, came a new wave of immigrants into New York. By 1910, New York City's population had risen to over 2 million people. Like the Irish, these new immigrants had faced very similar conditions to them in the 1800s, with many of them also forming ethnic street gangs, looking to seek out an area of New York to congregate for themselves. Now moving on to the early 1900s, Let's talk about these new immigrant groups, replacing the Irish in terms of emerging gang activity, which were composed of primarily Jewish and Italian gangs. The Eastmans, a gang comprised of mostly Jewish people, formed east of the Bowery, which was led by a man named Monk Eastman. The Eastmans' primary rival was the Five Points Gang, a gang comprised of mostly Italians, not to be confused with the same name given to the previously mentioned Irish slum, also known as the Five Points. This gang resided to the west of the Bowery. The Eastmans and the Five Points would often wage battles against each other, making them fierce rivals. The Five Points' leadership was under Italian immigrant Paolo Vaccarelli, also known as Paul Kelly, with his second-in-command Johnny Torrio. This gang would be extremely influential in the crime world, as Torrio would later become a valuable member of the Sicilian Mafia. On top of this, another member of the Five Points gang would later become arguably the most notorious mob boss of all time, which was Al Capone. In the early 1900s, New York City's garment industry was dominated by Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. They worked as tailors, seamstresses, cutters, and pressers, often in overcrowded sweatshops with long hours and dangerous conditions. Out of this environment emerged some of the most powerful labor movements in American history. Jewish garment workers were at the forefront of unionization, organizing massive strikes to demand higher wages, shorter hours, and safer workplaces. But these labor battles quickly turned violent. Some garment manufacturers responded by hiring gangsters to intimidate picketers, break strikes, and protect strikebreakers. This practice, known as labor slugging, became common in the industry. Violence was used as a tool on both sides of the labor divide. At the same time, Jewish street gangs saw opportunity. Figures like Louis Buchalter and Jacob Shapiro moved into the garment industry under the banner of protecting unions. In reality, they became labor racketeers, using intimidation, beatings, and extortion to gain control over unions, trucking routes, and factory contracts. While they sometimes fought employer-hired thugs, they also coerced union leaders, skimmed dues, and forced both workers and bosses to pay for protection. What began as worker self-defense gradually evolved into organized crime's grip on labor. By the 1920s and 1930s, figures like Buchalter and Shapiro wielded enormous power over the garment industry, profiting from violence on all sides. Eventually, state and federal authorities moved in, and high-profile prosecutions dismantled many of these rackets. But labor racketeering itself would persist in American unions for decades to come. Shifting away from New York, let's move on to another major American city that was experiencing a great deal of rapid growth population-wise, and a great deal of industrial growth, which was Detroit. As immigrants continued to enter America in droves, Detroit had an attraction for the surplus job demand and supply needed. Detroit experienced a huge rapid growth from the 1920s to the 1930s, with the industrial needs of World War II expanding this growth even more. Like previously mentioned in New York, Detroit also had an abundant number of Jewish immigrants coming in as well. During the industrial boom from the early 1900s to the 1930s, many immigrants moved into the city in greater numbers, with neighborhoods beginning to be established among ethnic lines. As a result of this, many of the earliest Detroit gangs can be seen from these ethnic lines being formed in neighborhoods, where smaller and unorganized young youths grouped together to protect local merchants and neighborhood residents from outsiders. Over time, however, many of these gangs began to act out of self-interest and for their own business interests, both in terms of power and finance. One of these gangs, who would form during this time period, and who would control the majority of Detroit's gang world from the 1920s to the 1930s, was the Purple Gang. The Purple Gang was one of the most infamous and organized crime groups in the United States. The Purple Gang were known to protect Detroit's narcotic dealers and were also known for bootlegging, extortion, kidnapping, and murder. The Purple Gang were so intimidating that whenever Purple Gang members were brought to trial, witnesses refused to testify out of fear, and jurors were afraid to convict them. This intimidation was so bad that prosecutors were unable to convict any Purple Gang members until the 1930s. The Purple Gang had its origins with the Bernstein family. In 1902, Harry Bernstein, a young shoemaker, as well as his wife and 6 kids, arrived in Detroit. With his shoemaking skills, Harry opened his own shoe store on Gratiot Avenue in the Lower East Side of Detroit. The Bernstein kids, seeing how life was for their parents, sought out the streets in order to look for ways to financially support their parents. The oldest of the kids, Abe Bernstein, became a skilled card dealer and stickman. This gave Abe massive connections to the underground world of Detroit, as gambling was illegal at the time. Through these connections, Abe was able to meet corrupt officials, police officials, and gang members. While Abe was busy meeting and establishing connections, Abe's other brothers were busy claiming and marking turf in the streets. Their turf consisted of the Jewish ghetto that went from Jefferson Avenue to East Grand Boulevard. The outskirts from their claimed turf went for roughly 2 blocks east and west of Hastings Avenue, where many of the Purple Gang members would originally come from. As a result, between the merge of the Purple Gang and infamous Detroit mobsters, the Oakland Sugar House Gang was born. This Sugar House Gang were an extremely violent gang who helped protect Jewish liquor merchants from other rival gangs, as well as becoming heavily involved with running rackets, such as against both non-union workers and union members, who were hired by corrupt union bosses to keep them in check. After being acquitted in labor trials, the gang became known once more as the Purple Gang. This mergence between Sugar House and the Purple Gang eventually caused some major issues. The merging groups lacked a sense of common identity between its members, with the original Purple Gang members still identifying more with their original identity and peers, all while the newer members were joining under its new Sugar House alias, and these members sticking more connected to the identity of the new gang, as well as those other newer members. Though the name had eventually changed back to the Purple Gang, much of the lack of harmony built into the gang would eventually lead to its downfall, as the gang would eventually eat itself alive with too many internal turmoils and power struggles between members. By 1935, the Purple Gang was over, with over 18 members having been killed by other members by that same year. Earlier that same year, Abe Bernstein, along with several of the original members, could see the eventual downfall of the gang. As a result, Bernstein decided to hand over the Detroit rackets to the Italian mafia peacefully, as they had been continuously striving in power at the time, with the Purple Gang simultaneously losing power. Though Bernstein gave away the rackets likely for self-preservation of his life, the Italian mafia still decided to give him enough money to retire for life in exchange. The Purple Gang had certainly made their mark in the gang world, becoming one of the notorious gangs in United States history, especially within Detroit. Its success can be attributed to street smarts, heavy strong aggression, and criminal organization. Its downfall was also ironically also due to their organization, with their organization becoming disorganized over time, due to greed and mistrust. Moving away from Detroit, it is useful to examine the early 1940s. During this period, the United States had entered World War II, which became the country's primary focus and drew attention away from domestic issues like gang activity. At the same time, gang involvement declined, largely because many young, able-bodied men were drafted or enlisted to serve in the military. However, by the late 1940s and into the 1950s, gang activity began to reappear. This resurgence included significant numbers of African American, Puerto Rican, and Mexican American youth. Additionally, gang-related violence became more intense and widespread, partly due to increased access to firearms and the use of automobiles, which made mobility and conflict easier. Changes in immigration policy and patterns of internal migration during the mid-20th century also contributed to a growing focus on gang development in the western United States. Mexican migration to the United States was already well established in the early 20th century, but it increased significantly and continued to grow in later decades. In the Southwest, the expansion of Mexican and Mexican-American communities became one of several factors shaping the social conditions in which gangs later emerged. While this migration contributed to population growth in those regions, these communities often faced discrimination and social exclusion similar to that experienced by earlier immigrant groups. At the same time, internal migration within the United States played a major role in the expansion of street gangs. Large numbers of African Americans relocated from the rural South to industrial cities in the North and West in search of better economic opportunities and living conditions. Despite these hopes, they encountered continued discrimination as their marginalization in American society had already been deeply rooted. Let's begin to discuss the city of Los Angeles. Before the 1940s, gangs in Los Angeles existed in earlier forms, but gangs as we understand them today, more organized, territorial, and violent, had a very limited presence. However, within a few decades, beautiful Los Angeles would soon adopt the nickname handle of street gang capital of the world. The escalation of gangs in Southern California would be the result of the two-pronged migration of millions of Mexicans from rural Mexico and large numbers of African Americans from rural America. Due to the high amount of migration coming primarily from Mexicans, we will first begin to focus on Mexican American gangs in Los Angeles first, and then discuss African American gangs in Los Angeles later on. Southern California underwent rapid economic growth during the 1920s, which produced two major outcomes. On one side, heavy promotion of California real estate attracted large numbers of white middle-class migrants from the Midwest to areas like Los Angeles and Orange County. These newcomers often brought with them strong nationalist and nativist beliefs, along with ties to movements such as the Ku Klux Klan. At the same time, this economic expansion created a high demand for labor, particularly in jobs like agriculture and domestic service. Many Mexicans migrated north to meet this demand, seeking better economic opportunities for themselves. However, most arrived with limited resources and access to education, making them especially vulnerable to discrimination and prejudice. In Los Angeles, Mexican Americans were often met with hostility and were treated in ways similar to African Americans. Because of economic hardship, they were concentrated in neighborhoods near and east of downtown. With little political influence, these communities frequently faced displacement as their neighborhoods were cleared for urban development projects, including the construction of the Civic Center in the 1920s and later Dodger Stadium in Chavez Ravine in 1951. Many of these impoverished barrios that formed during the mid-20th century have not disappeared, but continue to exist across the Southwest today. Immigrant labor from Asia and Mexico had been a central part of California's agricultural workforce since the gold rush of 1848. However, policies such as the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Gentlemen's Agreement restricted Asian immigration and reduced their presence in the labor force, which in turn increased opportunities for Mexican workers seeking employment. Mexican migration grew significantly in the early 20th century, particularly between 1900 and 1929, as many individuals came north in search of economic opportunity, especially in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution. Beginning in 1942 and continuing into the mid-1960s, migration remained high, with millions of labor contracts issued to Mexican workers through the Bracero program to meet the increased demand for agricultural labor during World War II. However, by the mid-1950s, negative political attitudes toward Mexican immigrants intensified. In 1954, the U.S. government launched Operation Wetback, an effort aimed at removing undocumented Mexican migrants. These enforcement actions often extended beyond their intended targets, as many Mexican American citizens were also subjected to sudden raids in homes, workplaces, public spaces, and even churches, with such practices continuing into the 1960s. Mexican migrants who settled in Southern California carried with them a social tradition called palomilla, which referred to groups of young men in a village who formed close-knit, age-based cohorts as part of their transition into adulthood. Within this tradition, there was a general acceptance of youthful behavior, often reflected in a boys will be boys mindset. After arriving in Southern California, these groups became tied to specific neighborhoods or parishes, commonly known as barrios, where young men were raised with the belief that defending their barrio was an important responsibility. Over time, these informal peer groups of Mexican adolescents laid the groundwork for what would later develop into modern Mexican American gangs. James Diego Vigil, a well known sociologist whose research focuses on gangs in Los Angeles, identified a process he described as marginalization within the Mexican American community. His work suggests that a combination of cultural and structural factors increases the likelihood that Mexican American youth may become involved in gangs. This marginalization can be traced back to the 19th century, following the American conquest of California, which had previously been Mexican territory. Further compounding this experience, large numbers of Mexican Americans were repatriated to Mexico during the Great Depression. Many of those deported were actually born in the United States, and upon arrival in Mexico, they were often treated as outsiders. As a result, they faced the challenge of adapting to a new environment, including learning Spanish, which had often been discouraged or prohibited in Los Angeles schools. Altogether, these historical and social conditions intensified tensions between white Americans and Mexican Americans. With this historical background in mind, it is important to consider what many view as a key turning point in the development of Mexican American gangs in Los Angeles: the Zoot Suit Riots. Sociologist Joan Moore, who is widely recognized for her research on Mexican American gangs, argues that the gangs emerging in the 1940s were shaped by a broader climate of social hysteria. She uses the concept of moral panic to describe the widespread attitudes toward Mexican Americans in Southern California during this time. Moral panics tend to arise in cycles and are fueled by heightened fear or public outrage, often driven by narratives from the media and law enforcement. These reactions are frequently directed at marginalized minority groups. Moore points to both the Zoot Suit riots and the gang-related case known as the Sleepy Lagoon case as pivotal moments that intensified white-dominated moral panic, ultimately contributing to the consolidation and growth of Mexican-American gangs in the region. The moral panic surrounding rising delinquency among Mexican-American youth grew exponentially on June 12, 1942, when 19-year-old Frank Torres was ambushed and fatally shot outside a track meet at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. The disorder that followed nearly escalated into a riot. In response, newspapers began publishing stories claiming that wartime juvenile delinquency among Mexican-American youth gangs was spiraling out of control. At the same time, the Los Angeles Police Department, whose resources were significantly strained due to World War II military drafts, attempted to manage the growing concerns about crime in Mexican-American neighborhoods. On July 27, 1942, tensions escalated further when a crowd resisted police efforts to break up a craps game at the intersection of Pomeroy and Mott Streets in Boyle Heights. Just days later, on August 1, 1942, a violent altercation occurred near a reservoir on the Williams Ranch, commonly referred to as the Sleepy Lagoon. This conflict involved youths from the 38th Street neighborhood, predominantly Mexican-American, and those from Downey, which was largely white at the time. The Sleepy Lagoon itself was one of two reservoirs used for irrigation in what is now Bell, California. For local youth, it served as a recreational space, functioning as a swimming spot during the day and a gathering place at night. Mexican-American youth frequently used the area, in part because they were often excluded from public recreational facilities. On the night of August 1st, several couples from the 38th Street neighborhood were parked near the reservoir when they were suddenly attacked by individuals associated with the Downey group. After the assault, one of the victims gathered members of the 38th Street group to retaliate. However, instead of locating those responsible, they encountered a birthday party taking place on the Williams Ranch, where Jose Diaz and other immigrant families resided. Believing incorrectly that the Downey group was present, members of the 38th Street group attacked the partygoers. During the chaos, Jose Diaz was killed, an event that quickly became known as the Sleepy Lagoon murder and received widespread media attention. In the aftermath, police launched a large-scale operation, detaining more than 600 individuals for questioning. Ultimately, Authorities focused on 22 alleged members of the 38th Street Group as suspects. On October 13th, 1942, the case of People versus Zamora went to trial, involving 17 of the defendants. The remaining 5 were tried separately after their families secured independent legal representation. This case became the largest mass trial in California history at the time. On January 12th, 1943, the verdicts were delivered. 5 defendants were convicted of assault, 9 were convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to terms ranging from 5 years to life, and 3 were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The 5 individuals who were tried separately were ultimately acquitted. The severity of the sentences, combined with what many viewed as insufficient evidence, led to widespread outrage within the Mexican-American community. Many questioned the fairness of the proceedings and argued that the defendants had been subjected to discrimination. On October 2nd, 1944, the Second District Court of Appeals overturned the convictions, dismissed the case, and cleared the defendants' records. Authorities chose not to pursue a retrial, leaving the death of Jose Diaz unresolved. Tensions between Mexican Americans and white Americans intensified in the aftermath of the Sleepy Lagoon case. At the same time, World War II added further strain to the city's social environment. Many white Americans were sent overseas to fight in a segregated military, while women and minorities stepped into jobs that had previously been reserved for white workers. Meanwhile, newspapers and radio broadcasts began warning the public about so-called Mexican zoot suit gangs, contributing to growing fear and suspicion. The zoot suit itself originated as a style associated with African American youth and jazz culture, but it was adopted by Mexican American youth during the 1940s. In a period marked by segregation, discrimination, and unspoken expectations that people of color remain inconspicuous in public, the zoot suit stood out. With its exaggerated features, broad shoulders, a tapered waist, baggy pants, and long coats, it challenged dominant ideas of proper appearance and behavior. Those who wore zoot suits were often labeled pachucos. African American and Mexican American youth also referred to the style as drapes or chukes, terms likely derived from the word pachuco. Because the suits required large amounts of fabric and skilled tailoring, they were considered expensive and even drew criticism from older, more conservative Mexican Americans. Hostility toward Mexican American zoot suiters was not based solely on assumptions of criminality. It was also tied to wartime conditions. During World War II, fabric was rationed, and strict limits were placed on how much material could be used for civilian clothing. Since zoot suits used an excessive amount of fabric, wearing them was often viewed as unpatriotic. As a result, police frequently carried out raids in neighborhoods where zoot suiters lived, further escalating tensions. In the aftermath of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Los Angeles viewed itself as highly susceptible to enemy attack. Civilian defense patrols were organized across the city, and beaches along the coast were reinforced with anti-aircraft weaponry. Southern California also served as a major military hub, and on many weekends, as many as 50,000 servicemen were present in Los Angeles. Many of the single servicemen on leave sought relationships with Mexican-American women. At the same time, servicemen who were married or already in relationships accused Mexican-American men of provoking or harassing their wives and girlfriends. Rumors also spread that Mexican-American youths were socializing with and dating the partners of servicemen who were away fighting in the war. This growing sense of jealousy, combined with increasing hostility toward zoot suiters, created a tense environment that ultimately erupted into violence. Anglo servicemen stationed in the city began engaging in a series of brutal confrontations with Mexican-American youth. By the spring of 1943, these clashes were occurring as frequently as 2 to 3 times per day. By May, tensions escalated further during what became known as the Venice Riot. Local high school students had complained that zoot suiters had taken over the beachfront area. On May 1st, a group of approximately 500 sailors soldiers, and civilians gathered at the Aragon Ballroom in Venice Beach and attacked Mexican-American youths as they attempted to flee the dance. On May 31st, around 50 sailors fought with Mexican-American youths near downtown Los Angeles, during which Seaman Second Class Joe Coleman was seriously injured. In response, on June 3rd, sailors from the Naval Reserve Armory sought retaliation by targeting anyone wearing a zoot suit, giving rise to what became known as the Zoot Suit Riots. During the second night of unrest, Mexican-American youths drove past the armory, shouting insults and taunts at the guards. Later that evening, when sailors were unable to locate zoot suiters in that area, they expanded their attacks into Mexican-American neighborhoods, such as East Los Angeles and Boyle Heights. Law enforcement in Los Angeles appeared largely unwilling to intervene. In some cases, their inaction seemed to worsen the situation, as officers were reported to have stood by or even encouraged the servicemen. This lack of response may have been influenced by reduced police numbers due to the military draft, as well as low wages that had remained stagnant between 1925 and 1943, potentially lowering motivation to engage. Additionally, many officers were veterans of World War I, which may have made them less inclined to arrest servicemen. Violence between the two groups intensified, with June 7th often considered the most severe day of the unrest. On that day, servicemen from San Diego traveled to Los Angeles to take part in the fighting. Roughly 5,000 individuals, both servicemen and civilians, gathered in downtown Los Angeles and engaged in attacks against Mexican Americans. In response, young men from various barrios organized counterattacks, at times drawing sailors into planned ambushes. After the violence subsided, the governor of California called for the formation of a citizens committee to investigate the causes of the riots. The committee determined that racism played a central role in the outbreak of violence. However, Los Angeles Mayor Fletcher Bowen publicly claimed that the unrest was the result of juvenile delinquency and denied that racial prejudice was a significant factor. Although most associated with Los Angeles, similar incidents occurred on a smaller scale in cities such as Detroit and New York. In these locations, white Americans also targeted Mexican American and African American youth, sometimes forcibly removing their zoot suits. Over time, the zoot suit style faded from popularity. The reservoir previously mentioned, known as Sleepy Lagoon, was eventually filled in due to expanding urban development. This broader historical context is important when examining the development of gang culture. The response of Mexican American communities to the attacks, particularly the defense of their neighborhoods against sailors and police, led many young people to admire those involved in resisting the violence, viewing them as heroic figures. One gang in particular, White Fence, came to represent Mexican American pride due to its role in confronting servicemen. White Fence continues to exist today and remains influential in several East Los Angeles neighborhoods. The gang has also expanded with affiliated groups, or sets, operating throughout Southern California and even in Las Vegas. A set refers to a subdivision or branch connected to the original gang. A large number of Mexican-American gangs in Los Angeles are concentrated in an area commonly referred to as East Los Angeles, which has one of the highest Mexican-American populations in the United States. The White Fence Gang was based in the neighborhood of Boyle Heights and got its name from a white picket fence that extended along much of its territory near the Los Angeles River. Originally, Boyle Heights was developed prior to World War I as an upscale suburb located on elevated land east of downtown Los Angeles, across the river. During the 1920s, more affordable housing became available, drawing in a diverse population that included Armenians, Jews, Russians, and Japanese residents. At the same time, Mexican immigrants arriving in Los Angeles began constructing makeshift homes in the ravines and low-lying areas of Boyle Heights. By the 1940s, Mexican Americans had become the dominant population in the area, especially after Japanese residents were forcibly removed and placed in internment camps during World War II. Despite this growth, many Mexican Americans in East Los Angeles continued to experience poverty, often living in informal housing that lacked basic services such as running water and sewage systems. Located east of Boyle Heights is a group of neighborhoods collectively known as Maravilla, an unincorporated area of Los Angeles County that many Angelenos consider part of East Los Angeles. Several gangs have historically operated in Maravilla, including one of the most well-known, El Hoyo Maravilla. Mexican settlement in the area began before the 1920s, but population growth increased significantly with the development of Belvedere Gardens. Although Los Angeles experienced major economic growth after World War II, neighborhoods like Maravilla and Boyle Heights did not benefit equally. Much of this disparity was due to limited educational opportunities and language barriers faced by Mexican Americans. At the same time, industries such as aerospace played a major role in driving the region's economic expansion. Maravilla was home to multiple gangs, many of which were named after specific streets, with territories that were relatively small in size. During the Zoot Suit riots, Maravilla was among the neighborhoods entered by servicemen, prompting local gang members to defend their community. Their resistance earned them respect within the barrio, particularly among younger boys who looked up to them for protecting the neighborhood. With the onset of World War II, many older gang members were drafted into military service, leaving a gap in local protection. Despite this, groups like White Fence and El Hoyo Maravilla continued to uphold their traditions, often becoming even more intense in their efforts to defend their neighborhoods. Both gangs remain active today, with White Fence maintaining a strong and visible presence in East Los Angeles. East Los Angeles continues to face challenges related to lower levels of educational attainment and economic opportunity. Since the 1940s, the area has also experienced limited political influence, which has contributed to major disruptions in the community. Urban development projects, particularly freeway construction in the 1950s, displaced residents and divided neighborhoods. Meanwhile, sensationalized media coverage throughout the 1950s continued to portray Mexican-American gangs in a negative light. African Americans have long experienced oppression in the United States. Even after gaining freedom from slavery, their access to legitimate opportunities within higher socioeconomic levels remained extremely limited. In search of better living conditions than those available in the rural South, many African Americans migrated to places such as Southern California. Like Mexican Americans, they largely came from rural backgrounds and brought with them strong traditions centered on family connections and church life. By the late 1920s and 1930s, African American street gangs had begun to emerge on the east side of Los Angeles, particularly around Central and Vernon Avenues. Social clubs were also established in downtown Los Angeles during this time. As the African American population grew in the late 1930s and 1940s, it gradually expanded southward from downtown along Central Avenue toward Slauson Avenue. Areas between Slauson and Manchester, which had previously been predominantly white in the 1920s and 1930s, became increasingly occupied by African American residents. Meanwhile, the community had already been expanding in Watts, especially between 92nd Street and Imperial Highway. These shifts contributed to the development of what became known as South Central, which served as the primary residential area for African Americans in Los Angeles. Among the earliest African American gangs in Los Angeles during the 1920s and 1930s were groups such as the Goodlows, the Magnificents, and the Boozies. The Boozies consisted of a network of brothers and associates who were involved in activities such as prostitution and robbery, operating mainly in the Jefferson Park area. The Magnificents were made up of youth from the Central Avenue district. While many of these early juvenile gangs faded by the late 1930s, the 1940s saw the rise of social clubs throughout African American communities, many of which later developed into gangs. Some of the more notable groups from this later period included the Purple Hearts and the 31st and 28th Street gangs. Although a few of these clubs initially aimed to function as political organizations, most served as a means of protection against white gangs. Certain groups did engage in activities such as petty theft, robbery, and assault, though homicide was relatively uncommon at the time. Weapons typically included bats, chains, knives, and in many cases, hand-to-hand fighting. During the 1950s, African Americans in Southern California formed car clubs inspired by similar clubs that were popular among white communities. Some of these included groups such as the lowriders, coasters, highwaymen, and road devils. At the time, the Los Angeles Police Department did not classify these organizations as gangs. It was not until the Watts riots that African American youth groups began to be viewed as a significant concern. Watts, a neighborhood in Los Angeles with a predominantly African American population, was characterized by a range of social challenges, including poverty, overcrowding, high unemployment, and elevated crime rates. On August 11th, during a period of extreme heat, police stopped a young African American man on suspicion of driving under the influence. A crowd quickly formed, expressing anger toward the officers. As tensions rose, individuals began throwing bottles and other objects at the police. When additional officers arrived, they were met with even more hostility, including a barrage of stones and debris. As night fell, the unrest intensified. Some individuals began throwing Molotov cocktails at passing white motorists, while others looted stores and set buildings on fire. Thousands of National Guard troops were eventually deployed, encountering armed resistance in some areas. What began as a single incident escalated into several days of widespread violence, lasting nearly a week. By the time the unrest ended, 34 people had been killed, over 1,000 were injured, and close to 4,000 individuals had been arrested. The impact of the Watts riots extended far beyond Los Angeles, contributing to a wave of urban uprisings across the United States over the following 2 years. Their significance was profound, as they played a role for African American gangs similar to the influence that the Zoot Suit riots had on Mexican American gangs. In the aftermath, young African American men in areas like Watts were increasingly viewed negatively by broader Los Angeles communities. During this period, African American gangs in South Central Los Angeles began adopting styles and practices similar to those of Mexican American gangs. These included displaying colors, defending specific territories, using graffiti, gathering in groups, and initiating new members through established rituals. By the 1960s, these groups started forming alliances, sometimes referred to as nation gangs. One of the most well-known of these, the Crips, traces its origins back to the mid-1960s. Across the history of street gangs, it is evident that young people have often formed groups for protection in order to improve their chances of survival. This pattern can be seen in many different time periods, from youth groups in the Middle Ages to colonial America, where individuals banded together for basic safety, and later among ethnic-based gangs, such as Irish American groups in the 1800s. A large proportion of gang members historically came from disadvantaged racial and ethnic backgrounds, and their primary focus was on defending their neighborhoods and protecting members of their own communities. However, by the mid-1960s and into the early 1970s, this defensive mindset began to shift toward what more closely resembles modern gang behavior. Gangs became increasingly aggressive, expanding their territorial ambitions and becoming more mobile. Activities such as drive-by shootings emerged, and many groups became involved in the illegal drug trade, recognizing its economic potential. During the 1960s, smaller neighborhood gangs started to consolidate into larger organizations known as nation gangs. The Crips were among the first to form such alliances, while rival groups eventually united under the banner of the Bloods. In Chicago, the Vice Lords grew rapidly, expanding from just 8 original members in 1957 to approximately 8,000 by the mid-1960s. One faction, known as the Conservative Vice Lords, attempted to legitimize itself by establishing a formal business in 1967. However, both city officials, including Mayor Richard J. Daley, and rival gangs questioned the sincerity of this effort, and by 1969, the initiative had collapsed. At the same time, other major gangs in Chicago expanded, including the Latin Kings, Latin Disciples, and Gangster Disciples. These groups eventually aligned into larger coalitions known as the People and the Folks. Despite these developments, gang activity did not immediately capture widespread public attention. One reason for this lack of awareness was that the 1960s and 1970s were marked by numerous major social and political movements that dominated national focus. Events such as the Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Rights Movement, and widespread anti-Vietnam War protests drew public attention away from the issue of gangs. Additionally, gang activity during this period remained largely concentrated in specific urban areas and neighborhoods, which limited broader concern. This situation changed dramatically in the 1980s, when gang activity expanded significantly. At the beginning of the decade, gang problems were primarily associated with major cities such as Chicago, Detroit, and Los Angeles. By the end of the 1980s, however, gangs had spread to medium-sized cities and even rural areas. Violence increased substantially during this period, partly due to greater access to firearms and the widespread use of automobiles, which allowed gangs to operate more efficiently across larger areas. The severity of gang-related issues did not decline after this period and has continued into the 21st century, remaining a significant social concern. Let's revisit the topic of Los Angeles gangs, this time focusing on their presence in the 21st century. Los Angeles and its surrounding county contain the highest concentration of street gangs in the United States, a pattern that began to emerge during the 1970s. Despite the broader economic growth of that decade, East Los Angeles continued to struggle with poverty, leading to growing frustration among young people. During this time, the African American Crips had already become a dominant force, and the formation of the Bloods followed as a direct response. Meanwhile, Mexican American gangs continued to expand, with groups like White Fence playing a leading role. Asian American gangs, including organizations such as Triads and Tongs, with historical roots stretching back centuries, also began to appear. While African American gangs often formed alliances across neighborhoods, Mexican American gangs generally did not follow this pattern. Both the number of gangs and their membership steadily increased. Although public concern about gangs had declined during the 1960s and 1970s, it resurfaced in the 1980s, particularly in Southern California. By 1980, estimates suggested there were over 30,000 gang members in Los Angeles County, and by 1982, many gangs had become heavily involved in drug distribution. The crack cocaine trade surged during the 1980s, with gangs controlling a significant portion of the market. As a result, gang-related violence and homicide became persistent issues in the region. Today, it is estimated that there are around 40,000 members of the Crips, Bloods, and 18th Street gangs combined, spread across roughly 400 sets within the city of Los Angeles alone. These groups represent only a portion of the broader gang landscape, as Southern California is believed to have approximately 2,000 gangs and about 165,000 total members. Los Angeles continues to serve as the central hub for both the Crips and Bloods, whose influence has extended to nearly every major city in the United States, as well as to several locations internationally. Chicago faces a significant gang issue, second only to Los Angeles, and since the mid-1980s, the number of gangs has grown rapidly. Levels of violence and homicide have also reached alarming levels. The city acts as a central hub for several major super gangs, most notably the People Nation and the Folks Nation. These are not single gangs, but alliances made up of multiple, smaller, well-identified groups. For instance, one of the largest gangs in Chicago, the Black Gangster Disciples, estimated at around 35,000 members, along with the Latin Disciples, are part of the Folks Nation. On the opposing side, the People Nation includes major groups such as the Latin Kings, with approximately 18,000 members, and the Vice Lords, who have an estimated 20,000 members. The Black Gangster Disciples are primarily concentrated on Chicago's South Side. The Latin Disciples are somewhat unique in that they are racially and ethnically diverse, which is less common among gangs that are typically more homogeneous. They are often found in areas like Humboldt Park and Logan Square on the northwest side. The primary rivals of the Folks Nation are the gangs aligned with the People Nation, including the Latin Kings and Vice Lords. The Latin Kings are considered one of the oldest and largest Hispanic gangs, operating across various neighborhoods, but especially prominent on the southwest side. The Vice Lords, dating back to the 1950s, originated in the North Lawndale area and are among the oldest of Chicago's major gangs. Their alliance with the Latin Kings largely developed in response to the formation and growth of the Folks Nation. Gangs in Chicago are deeply involved in illegal drug distribution and sales, which many disadvantaged youths view as a quick way to earn money. Like many cities in the North and Northeast, Chicago experienced industrial decline, leaving many young people, especially those with limited education and job skills, facing few economic opportunities. The city's education system has also been widely criticized. Sociologist Felix Padilla, known for his work The Gang as an American Enterprise, argued that Chicago's public school system ranks among the worst in the nation. Many gang members he studied described negative school experiences, including teachers who judged them harshly before giving them a fair chance. As a result, many students dropped out without completing high school, contributing to a high dropout rate. When feelings of hopelessness combine with social marginalization, the likelihood of delinquency increases. In neighborhoods struggling with poverty, limited resources, and economic instability, the conditions that encourage gang involvement and formation become increasingly apparent. New York City, the largest city in the United States, has a population that exceeds that of Los Angeles and Chicago combined. As discussed throughout this video, New York has played a major role in the historical development of street gangs. The European, white ethnic gangs that dominated in the 1800s have largely been replaced by more contemporary groups such as the Bloods, Latin Kings, Nietas, Crips, and MS-13. In addition, newer immigrant populations, particularly from Central America, have also formed their own gangs. Around 2001, New York City was estimated to have approximately 15,000 gang members, with the Bloods alone accounting for roughly 5,000 of that total. In fact, the Bloods have surpassed the Latin Kings, who were once considered the largest and most violent gang in the city. That same year, officials at Rikers Island reported that about 1,775 inmates out of a population of 15,000 were affiliated with as many as 47 different gangs. Among the most prominent were the Bloods, Latin Kings, Nietas, Five Percenters, and Crips. Gang organization in New York differs notably from that in Los Angeles. In LA, members of the Bloods often have close ties to others in nearby neighborhoods, creating more cohesive networks. In contrast, New York Bloods tend to be more loosely connected, which can result in less centralized organization. By 2004, Long Island, particularly areas in New York, was experiencing a sharp rise in gang activity, largely driven by MS-13. This Salvadoran gang aggressively challenged other established groups and also faced conflict with rival Salvadoran gangs. In October 2004, 6 MS-13 members in Nassau County were charged with the murders of 2 individuals suspected of cooperating with law enforcement. According to Nassau County Police, 6 of the 22 homicides in 2003 were gang-related, and 5 of the 18 homicides recorded between January and October 2004 were also linked to gangs. Authorities estimated that between 3,000 and 5,000 gang members were active in Nassau County alone. Both federal and local law enforcement agencies identified MS-13 as a major contributor to the rise in gang activity on Long Island. Mexican gangs were also present in the region. In Newburgh, officials accused the Bencard Barrio Kings of operating a street-level cocaine distribution network and being involved in at least 1 homicide. An 18-month investigation into this group led to the deportation of 23 Mexican nationals and the arrest of 27 others. In 2010, the Bloods were engaged in ongoing conflicts with rival groups in Harlem. Meanwhile, in Newburgh, a city in Orange County, New York, both Bloods and Latin Kings factions had been terrorizing residents for years along the Hudson River. On May 13, 2010, a large-scale pre-dawn operation involving roughly 500 federal, state, and local law enforcement officers resulted in the arrest of 60 suspected Bloods members and 18 suspected Latin Kings members. The FBI assistant director in charge of the Southern District of New York stated that the Hudson Valley Safe Streets Task Force had committed years earlier to addressing the escalating gang violence in Newburgh. Although Newburgh is a relatively small city with a population of about 29,000 and located roughly 70 miles north of Manhattan, it has experienced unusually high crime rates driven by gang activity. The Bloods and Latin Kings have been identified as the most prominent groups operating in the area. In both 2008 and 2009, Newburgh had the highest per capita violent crime rate in New York State. Over a 30-month period, 16 homicides were recorded in the city, with all but 2 or 3 linked to gang violence. For a city of its size, this resulted in a homicide rate of approximately 55.2 per 100,000 residents, nearly 10 times the national average. Among the Bloods factions active in the area were the Newburgh Bloods, Bounty Hunter Bloods, G-Shine, and 9 Trey. The Bloods primarily controlled the northeastern part of the city, while the Latin Kings dominated the southeastern section. Those arrested faced charges including racketeering, murder, assault, robbery, and drug trafficking. In 2012, federal authorities arrested Ronald Herron, leader of the Mad Dogs, a Bloods-affiliated group that had been responsible for violence in a Brooklyn neighborhood for over a decade. Herron faced multiple charges, including 3 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and racketeering. He had even posted a video online identifying himself as the head of a murder team. On a broader scale, although the Crips outnumber the Bloods nationwide, especially in Los Angeles, by roughly 3 to 1, the situation in New York City is reversed, where Blood sets are more prevalent. Crips groups have been active in areas such as South Jamaica and Far Rockaway, where they have been involved in drug distribution. In April 2010, a violent incident in Times Square left 4 people shot and led to the arrest of 56 minors during what authorities believe to be a Crips initiation event. Notably, the gathering had been organized through Twitter, highlighting the growing role of social media in gang activity. Alongside the Bloods, the Latin Kings remain one of the most influential gangs within Rikers Island. In June 2010, a Latin Kings faction was arrested for operating a large heroin distribution network in Bedford Park. In another incident, 18 members were arrested after throwing Molotov cocktails at the homes of a member's family when he attempted to leave the gang. MS-13 has gained such a reputation for violence that the FBI established a specialized task force to monitor and combat the group. The gang has maintained a presence in neighborhoods such as Jackson Heights, Elmhurst, and throughout Long Island. Another rapidly growing group in New York City is the Trinitarios, a Dominican gang that originated in Sing Sing prison during the late 1980s. Known for wearing green and often using machetes, the Trinitarios are primarily in conflict with the Latin Kings and another Dominican gang, Dominicans Don't Play. Both groups have been involved in drug trafficking, robberies, and violent assaults across the tri-state area, including New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. In Chinatown, the group known as Born to Kill has been considered one of the most dangerous gangs, consisting largely of Vietnamese members. This group has been associated with the control of counterfeit goods markets, particularly along Canal Street. Other Chinatown gangs include Ghost Shadows on Mott Street and Flying Dragons on Pell Street, which have historically been linked to lower-level extortion activities. Additionally, Albanian Boys Incorporated has emerged as a highly organized and influential group, to the extent that federal authorities have treated it similarly to a traditional organized crime syndicate. In some respects, its structure and operations have drawn comparisons to those historically associated with the Italian mafia. According to 2010 census data, Boston has a population of just over 600,000 residents. The city, which serves as the capital of Massachusetts, has historically been divided into distinct neighborhoods shaped by ethnic identity, such as the North End, East Boston, and South Boston. Boston's history of street gangs dates back to the 1830s, when Irish gangs were already active in the area. given the city's large white population and strong presence of various ethnic groups, particularly Irish Americans. It is not surprising that Irish gangs continue to exist today. Researcher Martin Jankowski found that Irish American gangs in Boston often develop from childhood friendship groups that later evolve into adult social clubs rooted in Irish American culture. Many of these groups originate in working class neighborhoods, where gang involvement can reflect a sense of pride and loyalty to one's ethnic background. One of the most well-known modern examples is the Irish mob, which has been involved in activities such as drug trafficking and protection rackets, often targeting illegal gambling operations and other underground markets. A prominent figure associated with the Irish mob was James Whitey Bulger, who became an informant for the FBI. In exchange for providing information on rival criminals, authorities allowed him to continue his own illegal operations, which later led to a major scandal involving the FBI. Before he could be arrested on racketeering charges under RICO statutes, Bulger fled and remained a fugitive for years. He was eventually captured in Santa Monica, California, where he had been living with his longtime girlfriend. Boston is also home to many of the same gangs found in New York City, including MS-13 and the Trinitarios. In 2005, articles published in outlets such as the Boston Herald and the Militant Islam Monitor raised concerns about possible connections between MS-13 and Al-Qaeda, alleging that gang members may have assisted in smuggling terrorists into the United States. However, while law enforcement agencies acknowledge MS-13 as a serious threat to local communities, the FBI has consistently denied any verified links between the gang and Al-Qaeda. The Trinitarios, a Dominican gang that originated in Sing Sing prison and New York City, have also established a presence in Boston and nearby Rhode Island. In 2010, the FBI's Boston Division arrested a Trinitarios leader in Rhode Island on charges related to firearms and drug offenses. This operation was carried out by the Safe Streets Task Force, a collaborative effort involving the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, and various local law enforcement agencies. In addition to street gangs, outlaw motorcycle gangs are active in the greater Boston area. In 2010, federal authorities arrested 27 members of the American Outlaws Association motorcycle gang. A 12-count indictment charged them with involvement in a criminal enterprise responsible for offenses including attempted murder, kidnapping, assault, robbery, extortion, witness intimidation, drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and weapons violations. According to 2010 census data, Detroit has a population of more than 700,000 residents. Among the major cities discussed in the modern era, Detroit has one of the largest African American populations, and many of the city's gangs reflect this demographic composition. Contemporary street gangs typically form for several key reasons, including racial or ethnic identity and loyalty, protection of territory, and the pursuit of economic gain. The growth in gang membership is often linked to marginalization and limited economic opportunities. In response to the social challenges facing many residents, local rapper Al Nuke launched Operation Hip Hop, a nonprofit organization aimed at encouraging students to remain in school and providing resources such as clothing and school supplies. Nuke, along with other Detroit artists including Trick Trick, Roy's, The Lodge Boys, and Seven the General, also participated in the Heal Detroit rally in June 2010, a free concert intended to raise awareness about violence and promote peace in the city's neighborhoods. Detroit has a long history of gang activity, dating back nearly a century to groups such as the Purple Gang. Following World War II, the city experienced an economic boom driven by the automobile industry, which provided jobs for many unskilled workers, often from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. However, beginning in the early 1970s, Detroit entered a period of economic decline as the auto industry downsized, a trend that also affected other Michigan cities like Flint and Saginaw. During this time, many delinquent groups began to adopt more defined gang identities, including names and organizational structures. By the mid-1970s, loosely organized groups had evolved into more structured and coordinated gangs. The rise in gang activity during the 1970s and 1980s has also been linked to the heroin epidemic that affected the city during that period. Drug distribution continues to play a central role in gang activity in Detroit today. Additionally, the large number of abandoned homes and buildings throughout the city provides space for gang operations and concealment. Detroit is home to a wide range of gangs, including nationally affiliated groups as well as regional and local organizations. The city's history of violence has contributed to its reputation as Murder City. One particularly violent group, known as Best Friends, gained national attention after being featured on a History Channel program in 2009. Federal authorities have suggested that this group exerted control over portions of the I-75 corridor, which has been described as a key route for drug trafficking into Detroit from cities such as Miami. In response to gang activity, Detroit law enforcement has worked in coordination with federal agencies. In June 2009, more than 36 individuals associated with multiple gangs, including the Latin Counts, the Folks, the Sureños, and the Jamaican Posse, were arrested as part of a broader effort to reduce gang-related crime in the city. The final city to be examined is Miami. Like Los Angeles, Miami is known for its combination of relaxed coastal living and areas affected by significant crime, where drug activity and violence have been ongoing concerns. For decades, Miami has served as a major distribution hub for illegal drugs. Similar to trends seen in other U.S. cities, control of the drug trade has increasingly shifted away from large organized cartels and towards smaller street-level gangs. According to 2010 census data, Miami has a population of over 400,000 residents. As in many large cities, a variety of nationally affiliated gangs operate in the area. Among the groups that have drawn particular attention from law enforcement are Crazy Locos and Making Life Crazy. Crazy Locos is a gang primarily made up of juveniles and young adult males, with an estimated membership of around 40 individuals between 2007 and 2009. In 2010, Manuel Medina, a member of Crazy Locos, was sentenced to life in prison after being convicted of 2 murders, as well as robbery and firearms offenses. His conviction followed an extensive investigation involving the FBI and multiple law enforcement agencies. Crazy Locos has been known to work closely with the Making Life Crazy gang. Members generate income through the sale of both prescription drugs, such as oxycodone, Xanax, and methadone, and illegal substances including marijuana, cocaine, and crack cocaine. Members are reportedly required to pay weekly dues to the gang, functioning as a form of membership or operational fee, which often leads individuals to engage in criminal activities to meet those obligations. According to the FBI, Crazy Locos operates as a criminal organization involved in a range of offenses, including attempted murder, homicide, firearms trafficking, drive-by shootings, extortion, and drug distribution. Another group of note is the Miami Gardens gang, which has been associated with drug trafficking, violent crime, intimidation, conspiracy, and identity theft. In 2011, 8 members of this group were convicted on charges related to narcotics, firearms, and identity theft. Additionally, Zoe Pound, a gang with roots in the Haitian community, operates out of Miami and has been linked to activities such as drug trafficking and robbery. In response to ongoing criminal activity and the growing influence of street gangs in Miami-Dade County, law enforcement agencies have established a number of task forces aimed at reducing gang-related crime. Well, I think it's safe to say we've gone over quite a lot of information, so let's try to summarize the gist of what we've learned here today. Organized groups resembling gangs have existed in various forms for centuries, with records tracing them back hundreds of years. Street gangs, in the modern sense, however, have a more recent origin. One of the earliest known examples, the 40 Thieves, emerged in New York City's Five Points neighborhood during the 1820s. This group, rooted largely in the Irish immigrant community, developed in response to the discrimination and marginalization Irish Americans faced as one of the first widely recognized ethnic minority groups in the United States. This pattern, where gangs are often composed of individuals from racial or ethnic groups experiencing exclusion from mainstream society, has continued over time. During the 19th century, New York City remained the central hub of gang activity. As the century progressed, gangs began to appear in other parts of the Northeast, including cities like Boston and Philadelphia, as well as in southern cities such as New Orleans, Baltimore, and Richmond. By the early 20th century, gang activity had spread to growing urban centers like Detroit and Chicago. In the mid-20th century, Los Angeles and Southern California saw a major expansion of street gangs. The emergence of groups such as the Crips, followed by the formation of the Bloods, contributed to the development of broader gang networks that would eventually spread across the country. Similarly, Chicago saw the rise of large alliances such as the People Nation and Folks Nation. By the beginning of the 21st century, these loosely connected networks had established a presence in cities nationwide. By the end of the 20th century, gangs had expanded into nearly every region of the United States. Today, they can be found not only in major metropolitan areas, but also in smaller cities, suburban communities, and even some rural regions. Over time, many gangs have become more involved in organized criminal activity, particularly drug distribution, and in some cases have grown more violent. Rather than being a temporary phenomenon, street gangs have become deeply embedded in the social fabric of American society, representing a long-standing and evolving issue that continues to shape communities across the country. Syracuse is New York's fourth largest city, reporting a total population of over 145,000 people in 2010. As with any large city, Syracuse has its dangerous areas that are riddled with crime, primarily due to gangs. Recorded history traces early Syracuse gangs all the way back to the 1960s. Like many street gangs, Syracuse gangs started off being very loosely organized. However, after the crack epidemic of the 1980s, Syracuse gangs started to become more organized in order to capitalize on this new drug market. The first gang we'll be discussing are the Almighty Latin Kings and Queens Nation. The Latin Kings' presence can be found in Syracuse all the way back to the 1980s. The Latin Kings differ from most street gangs regarding their presentation. The Latin Kings try to emphasize that they are there for their community and try to act as a family for those who feel lost or isolated. It was estimated in 1996 that the Latin Kings' total membership in Syracuse made up of 100 local boys and men. Though the Latin Kings claim to not endorse violence, law officials would disagree. In the summer of 1996, police reports linked 3 different shootings to the Latin Kings. However, though they claim to have linked these shootings to the Latin Kings, no murders themselves were able to be linked to the Latin Kings within that same year. The year afterward, in 1997, saw a great increase in gang activity throughout the city. 2 of the most prominent gangs in this year were the 110 Gang, as well as their rivals, Boot Camp. Common rivalry disputes between these 2 gangs have revolved around several reasons, including turf, women, and glares of disrespect. Such disputes have led to countless murders between the 2 gangs, including countless revenge shootings. The origins of Boot Camp stemmed from the merge of 2 former rival gangs. The first of these 2 rival gangs were the Fernwood Boot Camp, formed in 1994 by Tyree Allen. The goal of this gang was simply to make a profit selling drugs. Tyree would supply his members with crack to sell on the streets, with Tyree receiving the money, then cutting a portion of the profits to his members. In 1995, the Fernwood Boot Camp would be challenged by a group of young delinquents, seeking revenge for being denied entry into the gang. This gang would be known as Little Boot Camp, led by Caro Brown, who were known for being notoriously violent. Following a shootout, these 2 gangs would merge into the Boot Camp Gang. In June of 1996, Tyree, the founder of the original Fernwood Boot Camp Gang, as well as another member of the gang, would tragically die in a car crash. With Caro Brown now being the main leader of Boot Camp, Caro would now take the direction of Boot Camp to be notoriously violent, waging constant wars on rival gangs who were selling drugs on the south side of Syracuse. Kiro was now leading the boot camp gang with the combined directions of both the previous Little Boot Camp gang he directed, as well as the direction of Tyree Allen, who was more focused on drug control. For the following years, gang activity would continue to cripple down Syracuse. After hitting an all-time homicide rate in 2002, Syracuse police knew they needed to hammer down on this ongoing gang issue, particularly targeting boot camp members, as well as another gang known as Elk Block. From April 29, 2002 to April 15, 2003, the new Syracuse Police Department's full-time gang task force had filed over 10,000 charges against a total of over 5,000 people. Although these are prominent figures, many residents of Syracuse were still not satisfied. The main problem with these figures was that most of the arrests made were for minor infractions, rather than felony violations. Such felony violations include high-level crimes such as grand larceny, weapons, and attempted murder. In other words, although people were getting arrested often, the most dangerous of criminals were still roaming the streets. Residents of Syracuse also questioned how their police department allowed such a problem to get out of hand to begin with, often accusing the department of gang denial. Despite these criticisms, the department continued to make further advancements, including major ones in the second half of 2003. On August 8th of 2003, 2 members of the boot camp gang were indicted by a federal grand jury of violating the RICO Act by using their membership status to engage in drug possession and murder. A member of another Syracuse gang called Elk Block, named Demetrius Elmore, had been shot and killed in a drive-by shooting by the boot camp gang members Leonard Holbdy and Christian Williams. The reason behind the shooting was due to turf dispute, where Demetrius had been shot riding a bicycle to see his grandmother, who resided in boot camp turf. Nearly a year later, on June 28, 2004, Williams would plead guilty to Demetrius's murder. A month prior, 26 other boot camp members would also be indicted on RICO charges for their usage of violence and drug trade to control their turf. Most notably, among these 26 members would be Caro Brown himself. By August 2004, 24 boot camp members arrested under RICO had pleaded guilty, with an additional member having their charges dropped before trial. On August 3rd of 2004, a federal court jury found Caro guilty of racketeering charges and that he was responsible for at least 2 murders or attempted murders. Boot camp had progressed from a gang not considered a threat with low levels of organization, all the way up to a highly structured organization worth being investigated on the federal level. Boot camp serves as a key example as to what can happen when local jurisdictions engage in gang denial, and how big an issue can spiral out of control. The heavy crackdown of the boot camp gang demonstrated much more safety in Syracuse. Early 2004 crime reports indicate general criminal activity had dropped in Syracuse by 14% in the first 6 months, compared to the same time period in 2003. Although a prominent gang had been taken down, there were still further gangs to tackle. The next primary gang federal authorities began to target was now the previously mentioned Elk Block gang. With a former high competitor gang now taken off the streets, Elk Block began to seize control over the drug market within the South Side. Their control would be short-lived, as in July of 2005, 16 prominent members of the gang were indicted on RICO charges. With Elk Block now losing control, unfortunately came another opportunity for a new gang to seize control. The next gang to seize control of Syracuse's streets was the Brighton Brigade. However, their fate would meet the rest of the previous mentioned gangs, as RICO indictments would result in the arrests of 14 members, with all pleading guilty. The next street gang to become the next powerhouse of Syracuse was the previously mentioned 110 gang. As being previously mentioned in this video, this gang did not rise to power out of nowhere. They had been preparing their stride since 1998, with a hierarchical structure dealing drugs. The structure started with 3 dealers who would receive their drug supply. These 3 dealers would transfer the supply to OG gang members, who are known as mid-level dealers. These dealers then supply lower-level members, who would sell 8 balls of cocaine and crack to customers, who were given the nicknames of Licks. In 2009, 12 members of 110 would be indicted on RICO violations. The next Syracuse gang to face RICO violations were the Bricktown Gang. The previous gangs discussed that were busted by RICO violations all included violence between rival gangs members. However, the violence discussed with Bricktown involves civilian cases. The first case we will be discussing is the murder of Rashad Walker Jr., who was tragically only a baby. Rashad was killed by Bricktown member Saquon Evans, who fired a gun into the back of a minivan in revenge for a gang shooting that only occurred 2 days prior. The second innocent victim was Anthony Ford, who was shot and killed on his front porch. Anthony had unfortunately been a victim of mistaken identity for a rival gang member. The Bricktown Gang, like all other gangs mentioned in this video, sold drugs in their territory. The gang often scribbled graffiti related to the gang on buildings in their territory. An example of this graffiti is the symbol of 252, which symbolizes the willingness members have to spend 25 years all the way up to life in prison. In 2011, 14 members were arrested for RICO violations, with Bricktown's chief being amongst the arrests. By November 2012, all 14 of these members would be sentenced to federal prison for a range of violations, similar to the previous gangs mentioned. Throughout Syracuse, as you can see, street gangs have and still continue to be a massive contributor to crime. This issue will likely continue to plague Syracuse, as many of the socioeconomic reasons for their existence still continue. However, as you've also seen demonstrated, law enforcement has begun to treat the issue of street gangs with much more seriousness, as well as federal prosecutors now working on prevention methods, attempting to direct potential gang members away from gangs. In September 2012, the U.S. Justice Department gave Syracuse a $300,000 grant, which is one out of 9 grants awarded nationally to fund effort to reduce gang violence, with the grant being used to start a program called Syracuse Truce, with the goal of preventing further street gangs from being formed. Now let's talk about a different set of gangs from a different city in New York, called Rochester. Rochester, with a population of over 200,000, according to the 2010 census data, is the third largest city in New York, with the city also containing the state's highest homicide rate. A specific area of Rochester known as the Crescent makes up around 80% of Rochester's homicide rate, with the Crescent itself making up about 27% of the residency of Rochester. The Crescent is not one individual neighborhood, but rather a mixture of high-crime neighborhoods, together forming a crescent. The most prominent gang in Rochester are known as Dipset. Dipset is a local Rochester gang, with its membership reaching around 80, and most members' ages ranging from 15 to 21. In December of 2003, police arrested 12 members of Dipset. An interesting observation about these arrests was a lack of loyalty between the members, with many members quickly providing information to police in exchange for a reduction in sentencing. The Dipset gang from mid-2002 to 2003 also had been linked to at least 8 homicides. It was also stated that Dipset formed randomly between youths who grew up together, and as they got older, engaged in criminal actions such as drug dealing, robbery, and homicide. Some of their competition include gangs such as Thurston Zoo and Plymouth Rock, all fighting for control of Rochester's drug market. Street gangs have also had a presence in Buffalo, New York. In the 1960s, a gang by the name of Mad Dogs had taken over the majority of East Buffalo. Wearing jackets with Mad Dogs on the back, this gang would also engage in various crimes such as theft and disputes with other gangs over turf. One unique difference to Mad Dogs from most other modern gangs was that their choice of fighting often involved hand-to-hand combat and weapons involving bats, rocks, and switchblades. After roughly a decade, Mad Dogs disbanded, with many members turning to factory jobs for work. In the early 1980s, the next major gang to pick up after Mad Dogs was the FBP. The beginning of FBP started with a young group of boys attending the same local school called Future Academy School Number 37. As time continued, FBP became violent. The Future Academy School was experiencing a great level of gang activity, with many students being transferred or expelled. In order to join, a member needed to take a beating from the gang, otherwise known as an initiation. Anyone who would run away from the altercation would be known as a marked man and would now be potentially subjected to an even more harmful beating if caught. The FBP, like previous gangs mentioned, sold drugs, fought other gangs for turf control, and would participate in other acts of violence. The FBP would fade out of the gang world in the early 90s, due to many members dying and many of the remaining members being arrested. From the years of 1997 to 2000, Buffalo had an average of 40 homicides a year. While this may be a high number, it was still much better than the previous homicide rate in Buffalo during the first half of the 90s, which hit an all-time high of 92 in 1994. These more moderately peaceful times in Buffalo, however, would soon come to an end, with the Bloods and Crips now making their presence into the city. The recruiters for the Bloods and Crips came from the Bronx area rather than Los Angeles itself, which is the home of these gangs. Signs of new gang activity had become quite apparent by 2001, where the year had over 66 homicides, many of which were rival gangs once again fighting for drug trafficking control. In the early 2000s, it was reported by Elsie Fisher, the principal of Buffalo's alternative school, that Crips and Bloods were now using the school as a means of recruitment. Similar reports also began to arise from other high schools within Buffalo. Buffalo geographically has a huge incentive for drug control, as it is very close to both New York City and Canada. On November 26, 2003, New York Senator Charles Schumer issued a press release that Buffalo was in the middle of an illegal drug pipeline. The issue became so out of hand that local law enforcement wasn't enough to combat the problem. The federal government now needed to get involved as well. Schumer requested in his press release that Buffalo become designated by the U.S. Office of National Drug Control Policy as a high-intensity drug trafficking area. With this designation, it allowed Buffalo to be eligible for millions in federal aid to help local law enforcement. Senator Schumer was successful in his request, and as a result, has been assisted by federal authorities and federal income. In an effort to understand the growth of gangs, American sociologist Walter B. Miller tracked the spread of gang problems across U.S. cities from the 1970s through the early 2000s. During this period, the number of cities reporting gang problems grew more than sevenfold, from just over 200 in 1970 to nearly 1,500 by the beginning of the 20th century. A key element during this time period was the increasing availability of both cars and guns to lethal gangs. Drive-by shootings are a popular tactic used by gangs. A method naturally increased with the wide availability of automobiles and guns, which also changed the way many gangs engaged in fighting, as much of it composed of mostly hand-to-hand combat or hand-to-hand weaponry. Nationwide, every region of the country gained a rampant number in increased gang activity, with the South in particular beginning to see the rise in gangs that were no longer exclusive based on neighborhood youth protecting turf, but rather a new territory for expanded nation gangs such as the Crips and Bloods, to sell their product of crack cocaine, an epidemic that famously brought motivations to high crime syndicates. Another key element of gangs within their time frame of expansion across these 3 decades is the increase in violence. To illustrate this idea, we can look at the massive cities of Los Angeles and Chicago, which have continuously been home grounds for the rampant growth of gangs. As Chicago and Los Angeles felt their gang increases between the mid-1980s up to the end of the 19th century, these two cities would inevitably make up half of the gang violence homicide rate nationwide in 2001. Los Angeles and Chicago also began to drastically increase their citywide homicide rates due to gangs as well. In Los Angeles, 15% of all homicides in 1984 were gang-related, compared to 45% reported in 1995, a triple increase within the span of a decade. With such a high rate of homicide increasing citywide, and the tactic of drive-by shootings beginning to increase, naturally rose to higher levels of innocent bystanders getting caught up in gang violence, as public settings were being used more often to involve disputes. During 1987 to 1990, Chicago focused heavy analysis on the most criminally active gangs at the time, which were the Black Gangster Disciples Nation, the Latin Disciples, the Latin Kings, and the Vice Lords. The Chicago Police Department estimates that these four gangs alone made up of 69% of all street gang-motivated crimes and for 56% of all street gang-motivated homicides in the city. The highest points of gang violence during this time period are scattered. Well-organized gangs tend to provoke more rivalries, and in turn, attract more challenges themselves. This cycle often fuels sudden surges of gang violence, conflicts that flare up, subside, and at times continue intermittently for years. Similarly, observed in St. Louis, a cycle of violence process begins with a loosely organized gang, with loose bonds to the gang. The collective identification of threat from a rival gang reinforces the centrality of violence that expands the number of participants and increases cohesion. Next, a mobilizing event occurs, possibly but not necessarily violence. This escalates cohesive gang activity, and the group becomes more alert and cohesive. A violent incident against the threatening group occurs, followed by rapid de-escalation. Later, violent retaliation by the opposing gang occurs. Whatever the purpose of violence, it often leads to retaliation and revenge, creating a feedback loop where each killing requires a new killing, a common social phenomenon throughout the world of gangs that have established themselves in such major cities. With this repeating itself continuously, this gives birth to network structure that persists and may very well provide the conduit through which gang values, norms, and culture are transmitted to future generations. California researchers, led by George Tita, mapped the locations of 13 of the 29 active criminal street gangs in the East Los Angeles area, where predominant Mexican-American, otherwise known as Chicano gangs, first formed. In this area, gang violence makes up about 75% of all lethal incidents. Between 2000 and 2002, researchers recorded over 1,000 violent crimes, averaging just over 10 gang-related incidents per census block. A closer look at 563 shootings between 13 rival gangs showed that most violence happens along gang boundaries. Two of the most active gangs, White Fence and Quattro Flats, date back to the 1930s and 1940s, showing just how long some of these groups have been established. Quattro Flats was one of East Los Angeles' classic gangs. Mexican families began migrating to the area in the 1920s, settling in makeshift shacks built from discarded materials. The gang formed in the early 1940s, shortly after the Pico Gardens housing project opened in 1942, claiming 4th Street as its territory. Quattro Flats offered an alternative social structure, with its own norms, rituals, and enforcement mechanisms that functioned as a surrogate family for its members, many of whom grew up in marginalized households. Life in established gangs like Quattro Flats was guided by a clear set of values. Protection was paramount, requiring members to watch each other's backs. Loyalty was demanded, often tied to defending turf. Respect for older members was essential, and emotional support was expected, mirroring familial bonds. From the 1940s onward, Quattro Flats expanded to include 14 cliques, typically recruiting members around 13 or 14 years old and keeping them active until their early 20s. In its early years, the gang focused mostly on hanging out and socializing, but by the 1950s, physical fights, more often rumbles than shootings, became common among Quattro Flats and other gangs in Pico Gardens and the wider Boyle Heights area. Gang violence continued to escalate through the 1950s and 1960s. Although firearms were rarely used during this period, that would change dramatically in the 1980s. A combination of fewer committed young recruits and the lure of drug use and crack cocaine trafficking left the gang increasingly vulnerable. The influx of guns and drugs would ultimately shape its future character. Younger members stopped following the leadership of the OGs, original gangsters, and no longer sought guidance from them. Instead, they began creating their own rules. Meanwhile, many veteran leaders had become largely inactive, whether due to incarceration, death, or struggles with drug addiction. Quattro Flats fractured over the trafficking of PCP and crack cocaine, with members increasingly clashing with other young adults in the barrio, further discouraging potential recruits. As a result, the gang's influence waned, and its internal structure became irreversibly fragmented. Conflicts with adults involved in the drug trade only deepened these divisions. Meanwhile, street gangs expanded, and overall violence surged. By the 1970s and 1980s, Quattro Flats had transformed into a major gang, competing with the most dangerous black gangs in the area. By 2007, the broader Pico Aliso neighborhood was home to 8 major gangs and dozens of disorganized ones, with the Los Angeles Police Department noting gang activity was unmatched anywhere else in the city. Evolving from a barrio-based gang to a multi-neighborhood organization with a formidable capacity for firearm violence. Quattro Flats has remained one of the most violent gangs in the area since the 1980s. In short, Quattro Flats evolved from a classic barrio gang into a modern street gang, focused on competition with rival groups for limited space within a densely populated ghetto. The surge of gang problems in many cities between 1980 and 2000 reflects the rapid institutionalization of gangs and the influence of key socio-historical factors that contributed to their long-term persistence, particularly youth subculture, drug trafficking, access to more lethal weapons, public housing projects, and expanding social networks that perpetuate cycles of violence. Research indicates that the most violent gangs tend to share 3 characteristics: the number of gangs in an area, the size of gang membership, and the degree of organizational structure and coordination. Getting off the data collection period from Walter Miller, let's look at charted gang activity from 1996 to 2012. The first year of data collection in this nationally representative survey of law enforcement, 1996, has stood up as the single year with the most widespread reported gang activity, an apex that also was observed in Miller's data. Except for a sharp drop in prevalence from 1996 to 2001, reported gang activity has remained fairly stable since 2002. The onset of gang problems varied by city size. This figure illustrates the reported year of gang activity onset in the National Youth Gang Survey, organized by population group. In the largest cities, gang activity began to emerge in the mid-1970s. Over the next 25 years, from 1975 to 2000, the proportion of very large cities experiencing gang problems rose more than eightfold, from under 10% to 93%. The steepest increase occurred between the mid-1980s and mid-1990s, when reports of gang activity tripled in just 15 years. Medium-sized cities with populations between 50,000 and 100,000 also saw dramatic growth, rising from 2% to 66% over the same period. On average, the year of gang onset was 1985 for the largest cities, 1988 for Group 2 cities, 1990 for Group 3 cities, and 1992 for small towns and villages with fewer than 25,000 residents. Gangs that emerged in large U.S. cities before 1985 became increasingly permanent over time. Between 2007 and 2011, these cities reported homicide levels 5 times higher than those with populations under 100,000. In general, cities with early gang onset, prior to the 1990s, faced more severe problems, as their gangs were far more likely to be engaged in violent crime and drug trafficking. Gang-related homicides are most commonly reported in large population centers with long-standing entrenched gang activity. Later onset jurisdictions, often rural areas, smaller cities, or suburban counties with fewer than 50,000 residents, reported far less violent involvement. Today, cities with populations exceeding 100,000 host the overwhelming majority of dangerous gangs and gang members in the U.S., particularly older, more violent organizations dominated by young adults. These cities consistently experience high levels of gang-related homicides, intimidation, and pervasive fear, with very large cities housing the largest and most numerous gangs. A number of factors have been linked to the nationwide rise in violent gang activity, with drug trafficking often cited as the leading cause. During the 1980s, as reports of gang violence increased in certain cities, the media and some federal sources began speculating that gangs were migrating across the country to establish profitable drug operations, fueled by the growing demand for crack cocaine. This narrative especially centered on the spread of Los Angeles-based gangs like the Bloods and Crips. While some street gangs have developed into more organized, business-like criminal groups, most do not meet the strict criteria of organized crime. True organized crime groups, such as drug cartels, are marked by strong leadership, strict codes of loyalty, harsh penalties for breaking rules, and the ability to reinvest profits from drug sales. In reality, large-scale drug trafficking is typically controlled by adult cartels or syndicates, while street gangs are more heavily involved in selling drugs at the neighborhood level. Researchers have questioned whether gangs themselves move from city to city and cause new gang problems. A USC study in the early 1990s looked at 60 mid-sized cities and found that gang migration was not the main reason for the big rise in gangs. Instead, most cities that saw gang members move in already had gangs of their own. Other studies support this, showing that gang growth is mostly local, not imported. Street gangs rarely move as entire groups, though drug trafficking groups do this more often. When individual gang members move, it's usually for personal reasons like family or social ties, not to spread the gang. In other words, the majority of why gangs were seeing such a huge increase in their neighborhoods were mostly due to local city street gangs forming, rather than the expansion of a selective few. Walter Miller believes that for those selective groups, most gang member migration occurred in conjunction with the enormous U.S. population shift during the 1980s and 1990s to predominantly suburban areas. Researchers used trajectory modeling to study how violent gang activity has changed over time in major U.S. cities. This method groups cities that show similar long-term patterns, in this case, the share of homicides that were gang-related, and then displays those patterns over a 14-year period. The study focused on 247 of the nation's largest cities, each with populations over 100,000, to track their histories of gang-related violence. This analysis can be summarized with 4 key points. First, most cities in trajectories 1, 2, and 4 showed relatively stable levels of gang-related homicides over the 14-year period, with only minor fluctuations. Second, nearly two-thirds of the cities reported that between 20% and 40% of all homicides were gang-related from 1996 to 2009. Third, about 6% of cities, those in trajectories 3 and 5, experienced sharp increases in gang homicide rates during this time. Finally, the cities with the highest rates, trajectories 2, 3, and 5, were concentrated in 5 regions: the Los Angeles Basin, California's Bay Area, the Great Lakes, the Northeast, and Florida's Atlantic coast from Miami northward. Overall, it is clear that very large cities with persistently high levels of gang homicide are spread across multiple parts of the United States. Hopefully, this video provided you with a pretty good insight into the rapid gang epidemic era of America, with much of the reasons why this era started, as well as what has come as a result of it, that has shaped the current gang world today. Before ending off this video, I'd like to credit the source of information used for this video, which was the book called The History of Street Gangs in the United States: Their Origins and Transformations, the first edition by James Howell. And with all that being said, thank you so much for watching. In this video, we will be going over a variety of some of the latest trends currently going on throughout the gang world. The world of street gangs is changing and changing fast. For decades, gangs were seen as neighborhood crews, fighting for turf and reputation. But today, the game is bigger, more organized, and far more dangerous. From escalating violence tied to drug markets, to unlikely alliances between sworn rivals, and even a move into white-collar crime, gangs are evolving in ways that might surprise you. The first trend we'll be discussing that sets the stage for gang worlds to begin with is juvenile delinquency. While most young juvenile delinquents do not end up joining gangs, the reverse is generally true, that many gang members exhibited delinquent behavior before their involvement. This pattern has persisted throughout the history of gangs and is likely to remain a key aspect of gang culture. Adolescents who experience frustration due to various social and economic challenges and turn to delinquency are often strong prospects for gang recruitment. The combination of youthful bravado and the excitement of risk-taking fosters a sense of invulnerability. When these youths bond and form deviant peer groups, especially in marginalized, high-crime neighborhoods, it creates an environment that encourages gang formation. Established gangs frequently target delinquent youth as potential recruits to replace members who have left, been incarcerated, or died in the course of gang activities. Younger recruits are commonly assigned lower-level tasks, such as acting as lookouts during criminal operations. Gang leaders prefer younger members because they are more impressionable and are often subject to juvenile court penalties rather than adult sentencing. This arrangement also protects leaders who give orders without directly committing the crimes. However, the increased application of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act by law enforcement has introduced a significant shift, enabling prosecutors to hold gang leaders accountable by proving the existence of an organized criminal network. The next trend we'll be discussing are the exportation of street gangs. Some of the world's most violent and infamous gangs originated in the United States. In fact, many American street gangs have expanded their influence globally, creating international branches, much to the frustration of foreign governments. Groups like the Crips, Bloods, People, and Folks have grown so large that they operate nationwide and are often referred to as national gangs. When these organizations extend beyond U.S. borders, they are classified as transnational gangs. Two of the most well-known examples are the 18th Street Gang M18 and Mara Salvatrucha MS-13. These transnational gangs pose significant challenges for law enforcement because their operations span multiple countries, placing them beyond the reach of any single jurisdiction. MS-13 and M18 in particular have become major players in Central America and are increasingly tied to international criminal activities that connect back to the United States. The next trend we'll be discussing are third-generational gangs. The rise of transnational gangs has given way to the concept of third-generation gangs. These groups, including MS-13 and M18, operate on an international scale, engaging in criminal enterprises across borders. To understand this evolution, it helps to look at earlier gang generations. First-generation gangs were largely neighborhood-based, focused on defending their local turf, streets, parks, and schools against outsiders. These gangs typically consisted of individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds seeking to protect their limited resources. Second-generation gangs shifted toward profit-driven activities, primarily drug trafficking, and many became national in scope. Examples include the Crips and Bloods, which established sets or cliques across the country to maximize influence and revenue through organized criminal networks. Third-generation gangs, though fewer in number, have taken this a step further by internationalizing their operations, pursuing financial opportunities both within their home countries and abroad. The next trend we'll be discussing is a term by the name of web banging. The global rise of social media and technology has provided gangs with a powerful platform to exploit. Many gang members rely on prepaid cell phones to conduct illegal business and avoid detection by law enforcement. Beyond mobile communication, street gangs have established an online presence through websites that include memorials for deceased members, threats toward rivals, photos and profiles of members, gang-related graffiti, and even music or audio messages. The internet has also become a significant tool for criminal activity, including drug trafficking. This trend has led to the term web banging, which refers to gang activity conducted online. One of law enforcement's growing concerns is the use of the internet for recruitment, as it allows gangs to reach potential members far beyond their immediate neighborhoods. Recruitment strategies often involve posting videos on platforms like Facebook and YouTube, or inviting youths to parties advertised online, gatherings that frequently turn into recruitment opportunities. Seeing themselves featured in gang-related videos can leave a strong impression on young participants. As web-based gang activity continues to expand, its influence on recruitment is expected to grow even more in the future. The next trend we'll be discussing are gangs infiltrating law enforcement and corrections. The FBI has long recognized the problem of gang members infiltrating law enforcement and correctional agencies. Such infiltration poses significant security risks because these individuals gain access to sensitive information, including investigative reports, details on ongoing cases, and the identities of protected witnesses. Additionally, they acquire training in police procedures and weapons, which can further strengthen gang operations. Corrupt officers and correctional staff have been known to assist gangs in carrying out crimes and obstructing investigations in multiple jurisdictions. The scope of this issue is illustrated by data from the National Gang Intelligence Center, which reported that over the past 3 years, gang members have compromised or corrupted law enforcement or correctional personnel in 72 jurisdictions. Notable cases include a 2010 incident in Riverside County, California, where a sheriff's deputy was convicted for aiding her incarcerated boyfriend, a gang member responsible for 2 murders. That same year in Southwest Florida, a gang member who had nearly completed all steps of the police academy admission process was identified by an officer who recognized his gang tattoo. According to the FBI, members of nearly every major street gang, as well as some prison gangs, have been identified on both domestic and international military installations. Military deployments have resulted in gang members among service members and/or dependents on or near overseas bases. In addition, military transfers have resulted in gang members moving to new areas and establishing a gang presence. As you could imagine, having gang members infiltrate the military undermines security and efforts of the military. It's especially concerning the idea that gang members receive military-style training, which they can take home with them to the streets to combat law enforcement more effectively, as well as passing their knowledge off to fellow gang members. An early glimpse of a gang member with military experience causing havoc on domestic streets occurred in Ceres, California in 2005, when Andres Raya, a 19-year-old Marine on liberty, which is a form of military leave, shot 2 police officers and tragically killed one of them. Andres utilized military training he received to attack the officers with a technique he learned called slicing the pie. This technique involves the shooter rapid firing to clear a path while advancing on his target. Using a semi-automatic rifle, Andres drew officers into an ambush outside a liquor store in Ceres. Officers were finally able to return fire, killing Andres. Upon investigation regarding the crime, it was learned that Andres was a current member of the Nortenos gang. Andres, by the time of his leave, had already served a tour in Iraq. According to the National Ground Intelligence Center, there are indications that law enforcement officials in at least 100 jurisdictions have come in contact with, detained, or arrested an active duty or former military gang member within the past 3 years as of 2011, with the biggest branches of infiltration being the United States Army, Army Reserves, and National Guard branches. In the early 2000s, the FBI and the U.S. Army Criminal Investigations Department identified nearly 40 gang members affiliated with the Folk Nation stationed at Fort Bliss Army Base in Texas, another 40 gang members at Fort Hood Army Base in Texas, and nearly 130 gang and extremist group members at Fort Lewis Army Installation in Washington. A massive warning sign that should have received far greater attention to this issue was the death of U.S. Army Sergeant Juwan Johnson. In 2005, while stationed at Kaiserslautern Army Base in Germany, Johnson had unfortunately made the choice to join the Gangster Disciples. On July 3rd, Johnson went to park not far from his base to be initiated. An initiation within the context of gang discussions refers to the process of becoming a member of a gang, which often involves taking a physical beating from members to prove your toughness. Johnson had been jumped by up to 10 soldiers who were disguising their status as Gangster Disciples members to the military. Johnson had lost consciousness during the beating and was carried back to his bed by his new gang brothers. Johnson would never wake up that night, dying from his injuries obtained during the beating. In 2008, Rico Williams, a former Air Force senior airman, was charged in a federal indictment with 1 count of second-degree murder and 3 counts of tampering with a witness in the beating. Williams had been the first soldier to punch Johnson, with the rest of the group jumping in after. Though the problem of gang infiltration in the military needs more addressing, at least some level of improvement is being made. In the 2011 National Gang Threat Assessments reports, the FBI provides a table with the headings of a gang's name, their form of gang such as street gang, motorcycle gang, or prison gang, as well as a heading with their potential military branch. The next trend we'll be discussing is a shift in behavior with many different street gangs. Street gangs have long been associated with criminal activity, but recent trends show a significant shift in their behavior. One major development is the escalation of violence, which is closely tied to competition for control of drug markets. This dominance over drug distribution has become so critical that gangs traditionally considered fierce rivals are now forming temporary alliances to secure profits. For example, in the Rockaway Peninsula neighborhood of Queens, members of a Bloods faction from another borough collaborated with Crips to wrest control of a drug territory from local Bloods. This conflict, which had sparked years of deadly confrontations, eventually led to the arrest of nearly 100 individuals in April 2010 on charges including murder, weapons violations, shootings, and narcotics trafficking. This case illustrates an important trend in gang culture. Financial incentives are increasingly overriding traditional loyalties. Additionally, gangs such as MS-13 and the 18th Street Gang are forging ties with international drug trafficking organizations. Beyond violent crimes and drug-related offenses, many street gangs are now engaging in white-collar schemes, including counterfeiting, identity theft, and mortgage fraud. The final trend we'll be discussing is the attempt to make it illegal to be a gang member. An attempt to curtail gang activity within recent years has actually been the effort to legally punish individuals for even joining gangs to begin with. This phenomenon is interesting, as gang members themselves often get into legal trouble through the criminal actions themselves that the gang commits, rather than the actual action of even being involved in a gang to begin with. Although the idea sounds like a no-brainer at first, there are certainly potential legal issues that can come with it, especially the rights of citizens to peacefully assemble in public. Over the years, a number of anti-gang laws have been introduced, with many of them either pending or actually being passed to make it virtually illegal to be a gang member. In 1999, Omaha, Nebraska legislators passed Ordinance Number 34,926 as part of its municipal code. Sections 18-81, Declaration of Nuisance. Notice to abate states that any private place or premises within the city, which is used as the site of a juvenile gathering, is hereby declared to be a public nuisance. No person shall maintain any such nuisance. The police are given authority to abate the nuisance. In Arizona, assisting in a criminal syndicate is a Class 4 felony. If the criminal syndicate is a street gang, such offenses may become Class 3 or 2 felonies. California Law 186.22 states that any person who actively participates in any criminal street gang with knowledge that its members engage in or have engaged in a pattern of criminal gang activity, and who willfully promotes, furthers, or assists in any felonious criminal conduct by members of that gang, shall be punished by imprisonment in a county jail for a period not to exceed 1 year, or by imprisonment in the state prison for 16 months, or 2 or 3 years. These are just a few examples of states establishing legal penal codes, but there are certainly many others. We've gone over quite a lot of history in this video, and I would like to thank the source material used for this video that made it possible, which is the book, American Street Gangs, the Second Edition, by Tim Delaney. If you would like to go deeper into everything we've covered in this video, I've linked the exact book in the description below, which not only goes over the topics discussed in this video, but so much more information about American street gangs, such as theoretical explanations of street gangs, socioeconomic explanations of street gangs, gang structures and their processes of operations, female gangs, street gang intervention and suppression methods, and so much more. Use my affiliate link below to check out the book if you're interested, as well as to support the channel. And with all of that being said, thank you so much for watching.